don't know how many of you picked up on the Jones part. I didn't make Steve change his name. He already came to me as Jones.
Likewise.
And I want to thank your worship, awesome worship team, especially for doing that song, Courageous, because I was trying to think of how I could get out of this. We're here this morning to share with you because Seattle Community Church has been a huge part of the Mono Kimono ministry, both in Mexico and in Guatemala. And we first met people from this church during our short-term medical dental teams to Mexico. Later, you began to support the work of Mono Kimono in Guatemala, both financially and in prayer, but you also sent two really important teams down to help found the Mono Kimono ministry in a village called Yalu. We'll tell you a little bit more about this story later. Oliver asked us to tell you a bit about the work of Mono Kimono, but also to speak more broadly about the question of why do we do missions. We'll attempt to weave our missionary story together with the many answers to that question, and at the same time give you a sermon. We're not preachers, but we believe that God has built a message into each one of our lives.
So why do we get involved in missions as the people of God? Number one, because of God's great love for us. John 3:1 says, "How great is the love the Father has lavished on us that we should be called children of God." So missions is an act of worship, an act of obedience, and a way to express our thankfulness for the many things that He has done for us. We also get involved because of God's love for others. There are many, as we know, many needs around the world. Great spiritual need. There is, in many countries, people don't have a pastor, they don't have a church or even a Bible. There's a great physical need outside the U.S. We've heard this morning about the many natural disasters around the U.S. and around the world, and those are always bringing up physical needs. At least in Guatemala, most of the indigenous children are malnourished, and the average Mayan woman will only live to be less than 50 years old. Many people are abused in Guatemala as children, and then that carries into their families, and that this last song we heard spoke so greatly about fatherhood and parenthood, and they have no models, so if that's what they learned as children, that carries on to their parenting, it just leads downhill. There's a great educational need. The literacy rate in Guatemala is only 50%. I know for me, I can't imagine if half of my family and friends weren't able to read or write. It would be, I just can't imagine that. Another reason that we get involved in mission is because it helps ourselves. We grow in our faith, we learn new skills. We have the chance to do things that we may not have been able to do here. We can develop cultural awareness and problem-solving skills that we can use later on to apply in different situations. And then lastly, benefits our families. Our children can learn another language and learn patience, to be flexible and depend on God. Our extended families can learn and grow in their ability to entrust us to God's care and learn ways of coping that they may not have learned had we been nearby. Oh, and finally, participating in missions benefits the church body itself. Churches that raise up and send out missionaries have a broader view of the kingdom. They develop new leaders as a result of the training that they receive even before they go. And our guess is many of the people that travel on teams from Seattle Community Church have been a blessing to the rest of the body here.
This morning I'd like to talk about a missionary named Jonah. He became famous as the Old Testament prophet that ended up in the belly of the whale. And a few weeks ago, Steve and I were visiting some dear friends in Olympia, and the husband said, as a way of telling us how much he didn't want to do this particular thing, "I'd rather end up in the belly of a whale." And I thought to myself, oh no you wouldn't. You have never been in the belly of a whale.
You remember the story, Jonah 1:1? It starts with Jonah's commission, "Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come before me." Now we'd like to believe that Jonah heard the call enrolled in seminary, studied for several years, and earned a master's in divinity or missions, was commissioned by his home church, put together PowerPoint presentations, and took his wife and 3 kids to different churches and went off to language school to prepare to preach the gospel. But is that what happened? Jonah acted just like we have. Verse 3 says, but Jonah ran away from the Lord. He didn't just run away spiritually, he ran away physically, thinking if he could just get far enough away, he could outrun God's call to missions.
Perhaps Jonah had already tried all the big-ticket excuses. You know them. My kids are too young. My career is important. I can tithe from that. My parents are elderly. But God hadn't released him from the call to Nineveh. So he traveled from one city to the next, went to the port of Joppa, found a ship and headed to Tarshish. He even paid his own fare to get on that ship to run away from God. This isn't the behavior of a guy that's just confused. This is desperate behavior by someone who simply doesn't want to do what he knows God is asking of him. You know how the story goes. The storm comes up and the Gentile sailors are praying to all of their gods. And they realized that there was some religious fanatic asleep down below. So they thought, well, maybe he's so religious, he'll know what to do. So Jonah tried running. That didn't work. He tried sleeping, and they woke him up. So when the sailors figured out that the angry creator God was trying to toss Jonah out of the boat, they asked Jonah to pray to his God. Instead of repenting and asking God for a second chance by having the sailors turn around and take him back so that he could get into port and go to Nineveh and obey his powerful God, Jonah tells the sailors to throw him overboard. Now, I don't think this was some selfless act of service that he's willing to die to save the lives of the sailors. I think that he was doing intending to do the ultimate selfish act to get out of serving his great God. He was hoping to die to get out of being a missionary. He wasn't carefully planning on a big fish serving as a submarine. I mean, who could have thought that up? And it wasn't going to get him. He didn't think that some fish was going to get him to Nineveh. He wasn't. Jonah would rather be dead than be a missionary. Perhaps he didn't realize that he was being given the opportunity to serve the God of second chances. And it wasn't just a case of God not letting him out of a chore. This was a chance by our gracious God to allow Jonah to participate in the continually unfolding redemption story and be transformed himself in the process.
Verse 12 says, pick me up and throw me into the sea. I know it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. So the sailors did what he asked, after asking God to forgive them for taking Jonah's life. The verse says, they greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice and made vows to him. We know the feeling, oh God, if you save my family, I'll go to church every Sunday. If you save my job, I'll tithe from every paycheck for the rest of my life. If you save my marriage, I'll give up cable and the internet. The sailors might have prayed to this new God, if you save us on our boat, we will follow you.
Those sailors were pointed to the greatness of God, a God who demands obedience and deserves worship and our loyalty. God used Jonah as his instrument, even in his disobedience, to bring people to repentance. Through a reluctant missionary, the sailors learned about the one true God. Sometimes I've wondered if God has used my mistakes more than anything else to point others to his path. Perhaps like Jonah, that is the case with the first part of my story. Thank God it didn't end with Jonah sinking to the bottom, drowning, and never serving in obedience. I too am thankful to have had more than one chance to answer God's call in my life. So, next comes the big fish. It was a combination of lifeboat, jail, ICU, retreat center, solitary confinement, rehab, psych ward, and homeless shelter. If you've ever been to one of those places, you know they resemble the belly of a whale. They're stinky, they're crowded, they're dark, and they're bad for your long-term health. You can stay in there only for so long without falling apart or being eaten alive. But they're often a necessary step towards a second chance. here in Laurelhurst, hopefully in this neighborhood. My hope is that if you've been in one of those places, it was with a church ministry team or on a clinical rotation for your education, or you were visiting a friend or family member who works in one of those places. And if you have never been to one of those places, trust me, it's really better to go to Nineveh the first time you're asked.
So Jonah spends 3 days in solitary confinement, and he does what any repentant, broken believer would do. He cries and prays, and eventually sings to the Lord. Of course, the God of second chances heard Jonah's cry. Verse 8 says, "Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. But I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord." So from this dark, painful, sticky timeout corner, Jonah finally sees the light. And we know that Jonah got another chance. He went to Nineveh, shared the gospel, the people repented, and God spared Nineveh out of compassion, just as he spared Jonah out of compassion. If we read to the end of the story, we know that Jonah never reached perfection. He still suffered from depression, anger, and self-centeredness. Even so, he was a man used by God, because God gave him a second chance, and Jonah took it. It wasn't because Jonah was great, it was because God is great, and he was allowed to participate in Nineveh. So what does this have to do with Mono Mono and the Joneses story?
Those of you that have heard Memo and I speak in the past know that our story in missions is a long one. And don't worry, I won't tell you the whole thing. I felt the call of God to missions when I was 8 years old, and Memo felt it as a new believer straight out of Bible college. In 1976, we stood up at the Urbana Missions Conference when Billy Graham asked if we were willing to give up our lives to serve as missionaries so that others could find Jesus. It took more than 10 years for us to finish college, seminary, nurses training, so that we would have the education that we felt would prepare us to serve as missionaries. We were accepted by a large mission agency and went to language school in Costa Rica in preparation